It's considered that something like 15 or 20% of the health of a population is determined by the kind of health care that they get. And much of the School of Public Health is devoted to examining the kinds of health care, what health care is needed, how do you get it to people, how do you get them to use it, what are the consequences of a health program. Human ecology is concerned with the other 20%, the other 80%, that asks the question, where do diseases come from? What makes populations sick? What is our relation to the rest of the world? So it's clearly asking a great deal of quite different questions. And in order to do that, it deals with the relationship between the human species and the rest of nature at a number of different levels. First of all, there's the individual level, where we can talk about the human body as a metabolic organism exchanging heat with the surroundings, and therefore the temperature becomes an important element. Or it could deal with the relation of our species with other species. And these other species may be big ones. In the past, predators were important. Certainly lions, tigers, crocodiles, sharks. By and large, our predators have disappeared. We've become prey on them. What have remained are parasites. And there are zillions of kinds of parasites that have invaded the human species, sometimes from other species, sometimes from the soil. So part of the study of ecology, then, is the relationship of ourselves to the ecosystems in which we're living. And members of that ecosystem may be dangers, but they may also be beneficial. For instance, in agriculture, we're dealing with beneficial species for the most part, with the crops, but also with the enemies of those crops. So we're going to have to deal with very large ecosystems as well. Among these large ecosystems are regions. And in a region, we can ask the question, what kinds of species are found there? How many kinds? What determine their relation with us? How do we cope with them? Okay. Now this requires us to take the next step and ask the question, what is the relationship between the organism and the environment? Now, from the point of view of old Newtonian physics, the environment is given. It's a set of coordinates into which you insert a species, and then the species either makes it or doesn't. But that's not the way it really works in nature. First of all, species select their own environments, so that even in the same place, different species have different relationships to their surroundings. For instance, birds will select the habitat of treetops. And there are organisms that live at the bottom of lakes. And down at the bottom of the lake, they spend most of their time there, but toward twilight, they shoot up to the surface, grab something, and go back down. There are species which cruise along near the surface of the water, grabbing what they can. They're filter feeders. Some of them are predators. So the important thing is that organisms select their own environments. Ants select their environments either by digging down or by climbing into the treetops. And depending upon where they go, their problems will be different, their relations with nature will be different. And so it's not possible to talk about an organism in its environment without considering something about the nature of that environment. So the first point is that organisms select their environments. Secondly, they transform their environments. No organism deals with the environment the way it was found. For instance, forests create the forest environment. They create the moisture, the wind movement, the kinds of other creatures they find. And they create the weather in all kinds of interesting things. For instance, if you take a wood borer, and dig a hole in a tree, you can pull out a core, and the core has tree rings. When you examine the tree rings, what you're usually told is that the tree rings will tell you how old the tree is. And this is certainly true. But it tells you other things as well. The thickness of the tree ring tells you how harsh the environment was. A thicker tree ring is a milder environment. A very narrow tree ring indicates that the environment was harsh in that period. So that's the way in which we make inferences about what ancient climates were. Particularly, there are trees that are quite old, things like redwoods, sequoias, cecropia bush. So we're able to read the environment through the impact that that environment has on the organism. Furthermore, it turns out that at the edge of a forest, the tree rings are more variable. At the center of a forest, the tree rings are more constant. The reason for this is that in the center of the forest, the trees themselves are ameliorating the environment, making it more stable. Whereas out at the edge of the forest, the growth of the tree is subject to the changes from year to year. So no matter what organism you look at, you find that in one way or another they're transforming their environments. There's a slightly different meaning. They transduce their environments. And by that I mean that a factor which is environmental of a particular physical kind at the outside of an organism is something physically quite different on the inside. That what might be temperature on the outside might be felt by the organism as hunger. In Puerto Rico, as you go up from the coastland up into the forest, you encounter land lizards, lacertid lizards. They're about that long, kind of a bluish gray. They feed mostly on garbage and detritus. Now the problem with this lizard is that in order to be able to do its hunting, it has to be warm enough. Down on the coast, it's warm enough. As you get higher up into the mountains, it's warm enough only for shorter periods of time. And eventually you reach the point where there aren't enough hours of the day for it to do all the hunting that it needs. So when this happens, roughly at about 125 meters up, this is the boundary of the lizard, with one exception. And that is that there are also picnic grounds and recreational areas as you go up the mountains. In a picnic ground, the abundance of food for lizards is very much greater. You walk up there, you'll find lizards poking their heads in spaghetti cans. So what's happened is that this environment, which ordinarily would be too harsh for them, is a suitable environment. There's now plenty of food because in the short time available, they can get the food they need. So therefore, the upper boundary of the lizard is higher in those places that are rich in food. Now, when you study any organism, you find similar things. In West Africa, there are ants that live in the cocoa plantations and also in the general forest. In the general forest, their distribution, their abundance is limited. The reason for it is that these little ants that nest in the ground, they dig their holes, they dig their chambers. The rain clogs their tunnels, floods them. After a rain, then, the ants have to come out and start housekeeping. Now, this will take time, so the time they have available for hunting for food in the coffee plantation is limited. Except that in other habitats, where the soil is clay and tough, the anthills don't get clouded in, don't get flooded. And this means that right after a rain, the ants are able to come out and start hunting immediately. So in different habitats, different ants relate to the rain in different sorts of ways. In the work that we did with ants in the tropics in Puerto Rico, there were those that live up in the trees, and there were those that live in the ground. And we were watching the cycle of rain and breaks in the rain. Well, for an ant that lives in the ground, a rain clogs their entrances. So they have to spend a certain amount of time cleaning up. And it's only after they've cleaned up that they can go out and look for food. Another ant lives up in the trees. It doesn't have the problem of its tunnels being clogged. So when it rains, it'll go home up into the trees. When the rain stops, it'll come down and start feeding. So these two kinds of ants will be competing. The crucial thing that happens is how long does it rain? And in some of these islands, you'll get maybe 15 minutes of rain. If that happens, the ants are driven away, the ground ants are driven away. They're spending time cleaning. They'll then come back later to hunt, while the tree ants wait out the 15 minutes and then come back. So that even things that seem to be of the same kind have a different kind of relation to the rest of nature. In addition to this transducing, where a signal from the environment on the outside of the organism has a different physical nature inside. Aside from that, ants define their own environments. Now, one way in which they do this is defining the environment statistically. Now, the environment may last for hours, it may last only for minutes. And the way in which the ants cope with that environment depends on the duration of environment. But it depends on the duration of the environment from the point of view of the ant. So consider a scorpion and a bird, a hummingbird. A scorpion has a very low metabolic rate. Generally, it lives in the ground or under the bark of a tree. It'll come out at night and hunt. If it fails to catch anything, it goes back home and it can try again another night. The metabolic rate is so low that I've kept scorpions in an aquarium for months and I couldn't measure any oxygen consumption. Our impression was that they were dead. But then the environment gets a little more pleasant for them, and they'll come out and they'll hunt. So from the point of view of the scorpion, this is a very reliable environment. If it's not there today, it's there tomorrow. So in a way, the food supply of the scorpion is an average over the available food over the last few weeks or months. Are there any questions about this? Okay, the organism is transforming the environment statistically. Now, a hummingbird has a different problem. First of all, it's a small animal. It has a high metabolic rate. It maintains a temperature of about 40 degrees. And at the time that the hummingbird is raising its young, it has to be feeding them pretty much every hour. So if there's a heavy rain for several days, this will prevent the hummingbirds from feeding, and it could be deadly for them. So from the point of view of the hummingbird, the food environment is unreliable. Whereas for the scorpion, it's a pretty predictable environment. So the important thing here is that organisms respond not only to the physical characteristics of the environment, but to its statistical structure. Now, this is true of organisms of different sizes. Those that have long generations may be able to average the environment over a longer period. The environment also allows prediction. For instance, the silkworm has 2 generations a year. The late winter, early spring generation is living in an environment which is rather chill, but more important, it has a short day. The short days of winter and spring are influencing its behavior. And what that short day tells the silkworm is, you are the first generation. There will still time to be another generation this year. So go ahead and continue developing and feeding. The second generation comes in midsummer. Now the days are long and warm and pleasant, but that would fool the silkworm. It's telling the silkworm, this is the second generation. There is not time to get another generation in. Become dormant and wait out the winter. Okay, now, aphids are very small insects that will have a generation a week. From the point of view of the aphid, if it's warm today, it'll be warm next week. So the same signal, the warm days, is a signal to the aphid, go ahead and continue developing. Now from this, it's important to reach the conclusion that the environment has a statistical quality, that organisms read the statistical nature of the environment, whether the environment is predictable or not, and for how long. All right, so the organisms select, transform, transduce, define their own environments, define the environment statistically. They also respond to the environment in the sense that their physiology carries with it the imprint of the conditions in which it grew up. Mosquitoes in a warm environment will be smaller. They will also have a shorter generation time. And so when you deal with the population dynamics of mosquitoes, you have to consider not simply what is the average temperature requirement of a mosquito, but what is its relation to temperature in this particular climate. Now this will change the demography of the mosquito, because a small mosquito is subject to more heat stress. If you have villages a few kilometers apart along a river, they may be too far apart for the mosquitoes to get back and forth, in which case each village is a separate population of mosquitoes. This is good for us because it means we can have mosquito control over a village at a time. On the other hand, in the warmer conditions, this whole riverfront can be one population with mosquitoes moving back and forth. So what I want you to get out of all of this is that organisms live in their own kinds of environments. They transform statistically, physically, and therefore when we study an organism, we have to ask, what is its effective environment, not what are the physical measurements in a particular place. Next, an organism lives in an ecosystem, which means that it's living with a large array of different organisms. Some of them are enemies, some of them are competitors. And it means that an organism may live well in an environment that's not good for it. For instance, in Great Salt Lake, there are shrimp, brine shrimp. These brine shrimp don't particularly prefer salt water. They would get along better with less salty water. But the reason they're so abundant in the Great Salt Lake is that their enemies can't tolerate it. So the abundance and distribution of an organism depends not only on its own physiology, but on the physiologies of its neighbors. One of my colleagues did an experiment in the forest where he made a table, a census of species that were throughout this forest. Then he scraped away the vegetation and planted only this one species. What he found was that its abundance was not the same. It was much more abundant now than it had been in the natural forest. What happened was that he put it in an environment where the physical conditions were better. So we're always faced with the question, not only what are the physical conditions acting on a species, but also what are the other species around and how might this affect the species in question. Finally, the species carry with them the imprint of their environment. For instance, their size. This means that you can go to a place and you can read the environment by reading the species present. So when I was studying islands in the Caribbean, very often we couldn't spend very long on one island. What we would do is make a collection, and we'll see whether the legs of these flies were longer than another island's or shorter, whether they were adapted to the temperature or not. The second thing we did was make a collection of all the invertebrates on the island, and from the array of invertebrates, we would determine which climates were suitable. Because one of the things we did was take flies from the high mountains in Puerto Rico and release them on a tiny island in the Caribbean. Then we would make collections the next day and the day after, and we found that the introduced flies lasted 3 or 4 days, whereas the life expectancy of the native flies was a week or two. So this difference was a measure of how suitable these two climates were for the different species. And that was better than measuring the temperatures and putting them in a bottle. He was measuring them in relation to their whole environments. Okay, now this is a kind of introduction to the ways in which organisms relate to environment. The same phenomenon that we talk about contemporaneously occurs over time. And it's possible to read the environments of the past through the fossils, through the organisms that were present. This is done in several ways. One way is simply see what species were present. And you'll find, for instance, pollen from cold climates found in tropical areas, or tropical pollen up in Spitsbergen Island. So these are indicators of what the climates were like in the past. When we get to humans, the situation becomes more complicated in several different ways. One way is that each human society relates to nature in a different way. Whereas an ant is an ant is an ant, more or less. Over the last 10 or 12,000 years, we've changed our way of life many times. For the first maybe 500 generations, or more than that, 5,000 generations, we were hunters and gatherers. Hunting and gathering is usually not a very reliable source of food. It becomes reliable in those places where game was abundant. We find that in the Middle East fossils, the bones of gazelles are very abundant. That seems to have been the main food of the prehistoric hunters. Then later on, gazelles become more rare, and you start getting mixtures of antelope and buffalo and other things, wild goats and sheep. About 10,000 years ago, people began planting crops. Now, why they did this is not obvious. They may have been running out of game, or it may be simply that they could afford to stick around one place and therefore watch a crop all the way through from planting to harvesting. In the transition from hunter-gatherers to crop growers, sometimes they moved in and out of one activity. For instance, the Apache were migrating from Canada down to the southwest along the edge of the Rockies. And along the way, they sometimes hunted, sometimes grew crops. From their point of view, the distinction between hunting and crop growing was not a major intellectual category. It's just different things that they did. The Shoshone did not grow crops, but they gathered acorns. And in order to allow the acorns to prosper, they would dig little ditches and direct the water toward the places where there were abundant acorns. So the management of water came along prior to the regular agriculture. In the Middle East, the Watufians used to build short terraces of rock, enclosures of rock. And the way they worked it is that about 10 acres of rock could gather enough water for about 1 acre of planting things. So this was again a transition to agriculture. We usually make a distinction between horticulture and agriculture. Horticulture involves planting individual plants that are important enough to us that we pay attention to them. This would be true of gourds, fruits. People will tend particular individual trees, take care of them if they're infected. On the other hand, agriculture involves the scattering of seed in relatively large numbers with a relatively high mortality. In ancient times, you could estimate that you could get 3 or 4 seeds for each seed planted. Now this meant that crops were not very abundant. So of these 2 or 3 or 4 seeds,